Um, it's a little hard to focus with that news, but that's the challenge of this morning. And I'm going to start by trying to put the 12 links of dependent arising in some sort of overall perspective. And I'm going to use, lucky for me, considering what I just shared with you, I'm going to be able to lean directly on words from Jeffrey Hopkins from one of the books, The Wheel of Life. That's one of the books that are part of this class. But then also a second one that you may or may not have heard. So Jeffrey Hopkins writes, the 12 links of cause and effect, which we now are somewhat familiar with from looking at and studying to some degree, and we'll go a little further into them today. Starting with the rooster, the snake, pig at the center, the painting graphically indicates that desire, hatred, and ignorance are at the core of the process, the root problem being ignorance. These lead to favorable and unfavorable actions. Those favorable and unfavorable actions lead to birth in the 6 realms of cyclic existence. The process by which this takes place in the 12 links of dependent arising, which according to this system of explanation, takes place in multiple lifetimes. Remember, we talked about that as it applied to a Buddhist worldview as we started talking about the 12 links last class. The first 2.5 links are connected to a past life. And again, for those of us who aren't Buddhists, you could think of this as moving from mental state to mental state within the realm of your moment by moment, hour by hour, day by day, week by week existence that you're living in right now. Because we learned enough from looking at and talking about the 6 realms and how we move between them constantly and almost simultaneously at some times, that you certainly can apply what we're going to talk about today to that. So the first 2.5 links are directly connected to a past lifetime. The second half of the third link plus the 7 are in this present lifetime. We're going to talk a lot about those today because that's where we can do the work. We can do the work that can make a difference and do some transformation of what we've been experiencing in the suffering realm. And then the last 2 in the immediate following lifetime. So as an experiential flow of moving between mental states from one realm of existence to another, from suffering to happiness, impermanently, as those are not permanent states, as we experience them in this suffering existence, and then also within the Buddhist context of the cycle of life from one lifetime to another. This is kind of what we're talking about here. So, this process, Jeffrey says, this process becomes more complex as detail is pursued. That's why I've taken so many classes to talk about the wheel, and finishing today with the rest of the discussion on the 12 links of dependent origination. It's not really something you could just talk about in a one session class. So time out here to say thank you and all my gratitude to all of you for attending these sessions, whether you're here on Sunday mornings or reviewing them on the YouTube recordings themselves. So just as in this lifetime, Jeffrey continues, attachment and grasping, the 8th and 9th link, nourish a karmic potency to produce the next lifetime. So in the lifetime immediately before this one, another set of attachment and grasping, not explicitly indicated in the 12 links, nourish a potency established by an action, that second link, that was motivated by ignorance, that first link, and deposited on the causal consciousness. Remember, we talked about how seeds are planted through actions in that first half of consciousness called causal consciousness. Then that potency becomes actualized in this present lifetime. And during the present lifetime, another potency established by an action that was motivated by ignorance is being actualized later to turn into the next lifetime. And that we'll end up talking about that. And then there's all the filling or fulfilling karmic ripenings that are happening moment by moment that make us who we are in this lifetime. And that's what we have to work with. And that's what I'm going to try to focus on today as we go through the rest of the links. But I do just want to read one other reading that I pulled from another teacher, wonderful Buddhist teacher from the Theravada tradition, which is the Pali tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, not Tibetan Buddhism, of Buddhism. His name's Joseph Goldstein. He says perhaps the most profound part of the Buddha's teaching, he's talking about the wheel, is the description of how this wheel of life, death, and rebirth continues rolling on. Because there is birth, there is disease, there is sorrow, there is decay, pain, suffering, and death. And so the wheel goes on, an impersonal chain of causality, he says. The insight into all the links of the chain of existence is expressed in what we call the law of dependent origination. So that's what we've been talking about a little bit starting in the last class. We were talking about the process of how does the wheel unfold, starting from the center wheel of the three poisons, center circle of the three poisons. And the thing that you have to look squarely in the face is what Joseph says next. But there is nothing we can do now about a mind-body process. He's talking about the constant dependent origination that is happening moment by moment in all of our lives. He says, this is conditioned by past ignorance and having taken birth. So we're in the stream, we're in suffering existence. We can't do anything about it in the sense that it's, all he's saying is that it's happening. So he's saying, acknowledge that. And what the wheel is really all about is what do we do? What can we do with being where we are? Which is why we're doing this class. We think the wheel has something to offer us to work with having taken birth through sort of our ignorance of not correctly apprehending how things really are. So he says, there's no way to avoid contact. We're going to talk about contact shortly as one of the wheel's 12 links of dependent originating. Very, very important link that I'm going to try to put a lot of emphasis on as we move on today. He says there's no possible way of closing off all of the sense organs, even if that were desirable. Which I think he's inferring that it's not. It's not like we want to shut down and stop living, essentially. He basically says if there's contact, there's no way of preventing feeling from arising. Because of contact, feeling will be there. It's a common factor of mind. But it is right at this point, he says, that the chain, he's talking about the chain of dependent originating process, on and on, can be broken. So we're gonna bring this into the light today, joyously. Trust me, even though it sounds a little bit dark right at the moment. So he continues and says, understanding the law of dependent origination, how because of one thing something else arises. By understanding that, we can begin to break the chain of conditioning. This is the habitual patterns that we have in our dependent arising experiences moment by moment. There's a way to work with them. So when pleasant things arise, we don't cling. If we're successfully able to work with them, he's saying that that's possible. When unpleasant things arise, we don't condemn or discriminate or hate. You can put a lot of words on that. And when neutral things arise, we're not forgetful. The Buddha said that the way of forgetfulness is the way of death. He's talking about the opposite of being mindful. Mindful of what? How things really work. He's talking about waking up, which is why I named this course, Wake Up Now. and that the way of wisdom and awareness is the path to the deathless. We are free to break this chain, to free ourselves from conditioned reactions. It takes a powerful mindfulness in every moment not to allow feelings to generate desire. And we'll get under the hood with that, especially when we talk about contact in a few moments. So he ends by saying, when there's ignorance in the mind, feeling conditions desire. If there's something pleasant, we want it. Something unpleasant, we desire to get rid of it. But instead of ignorance in the mind, there is wisdom and awareness. Then we experience feeling, but don't compulsively or habitually grasp or push away. This is what wisdom is. This is this apprehending things with truly and correctly versus ignorantly or misapprehending things. If the feelings are pleasant, we experience them mindfully without clinging. If unpleasant, we experience them mindfully without condemning. So, he's saying the same thing that I was saying a moment ago. So if we're not generating the energy, there's that he's talking about this whole process we've been talking that happens endlessly in our lives. That is the path. If we end that generating of that kind of energy, there can be no rebirth, no disease, no old age, or no death. And again, for those of us who are maybe not fully on the Buddhist path or even on the Buddhist path at all, you can think about that as transformation of suffering moment by moment, afflicted mental state by afflicted mental state, ending that. It's the same thing. And we become truly free, no longer driven on by ignorance and desire. The whole mass of suffering is brought to an end. So this is what he says is possible. And Jeffrey Hopkins is saying the same thing. And so I thought it would be good to start the class with that. Also gives me a moment to pull myself together, considering what we talked about at the top of the class. So I'm going to share my screen now, just to quickly go through. You will see, I'm going to share my desktop, so you'll see yourselves for a moment, and then I'll flip to what I want to move to right away, because there's a lot of screens I want to share with you. So it's easier to share the desktop. So just real quick, these are the 12 links. We went through them last time, but they are ignorance, which motivates an action, at the end of which a predisposition, we talked about that, is established on a consciousness, meaning our own. And that predisposition being established is called the cause consciousness, through that karmic completion of an action that then we bring into our consciousness. This leads, after a long time, it could be, as we discussed last time, it takes us then to rebirth, which is called effect consciousness. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how, I thought more about it after our last class. I'm going to talk more about how this could be pulled out of the perspective of the rebirth, context of Buddhist, the way the wheels present it. Just again to make that extra effort to make it a more contemporary presentation dealing with our afflicted mental states. But essentially that then leads to the beginning of a new lifetime, or we could think of that as a fresh new mental state, whether that's good or bad. And then that leads to the next stage of development of an embryo. That's the stage that that's the link we call name and form. We'll talk a little bit more about that moving through the rest of the 12 that I'm talking about here in a little bit more detail. That's followed by the development of the 6 sense spheres. Those are both mental and physical. Again, we'll talk about them in more detail. Contact, which is really critical, which leads to feelings, which leads to attachment, which we've talked a lot about in terms of where that comes from. That leads to what is considered a more intense form of attachment, which is actual grasping. And then that is powerful enough to lead to the next link, which is existence. And in the context of the wheel, we're already in an existent phase here. And you'll see that in another one of my, my graphs. But here we're talking about a new existence, another existence. And then that leads to birth, aging, and death. So that's the quick walk through the 12 links of dependent origination. Just real quickly, I want to just review a tiny bit what we talked about last time. I spent so much time talking about the first two links because they're so important to having a grounding in understanding and connecting everything all the way back to the center hub of the three poisons, especially misapprehension or ignorance or lack of wisdom. That was talking about the first link, which is called ignorance, the blind person. That was led to an in-depth discussion of action, which is really once our mind moves, it has to create either positive or negative experiences, which are constantly being planted in our minds. That's represented by the two halves in the second wheel that emanates out from the center wheel of virtuous and non-virtuous activities. And that propels us into one of the six realms. So we talked a lot about those two links, and that led us to talking about the third link, which is consciousness. And I talked a lot about the projecting karma, that type of karma that occurs right at the end of life, which is the main cause for literally moving into your consciousness, moving into its next incarnation, if you will. And again, for those of you who aren't Buddhist and don't buy into that world view or cosmology, you could think of this as, I call them mini deaths. You might remember in the last class, I talked about how life and death can, in the human experience and all sentient beings' experiences, could be boiled down to one breath. An exhale and an inhale is one lifetime. It's a mini death over and over. We only have so many breaths. And when they're done, we're done. So within the flow of that life experience that we're living in now, you can think about your afflicted mental states, which we discussed in great detail as we discussed the six realms. You could think about those as you move from one mental state to another. You could think of those as sort of a mini death and moving into another life as you move from one afflicted mental state into another. So keep that in mind as we sort of move forward. It's a way to, make it less academic and maybe more meaningful in terms of how the hell can I actually work with these 12 links? Understanding them is one thing, but then how do we work with them, in the here and now? So, as we move from the first half of consciousness to the second half, that third link, because there are two parts, we come to the projected effect is the second half. And that's what brings us into this lifetime or new mental state in one of the six realms. Again, we'll start to bake that into the way I talk about this. And that's due to karma. We talked about that last time, how actions are completed and then they ripen and then their experiences, that cause and effect. And again, push that all the way back to the first link. That's all because ignorance underlies this entire process that we're going to talk about further today. With that being said, again, there is a way to improve life in this existence. And that's why learning about cause and effect and what we base it on is so important, because with that knowledge, we could actually do certain meditation practices and mindfulness exercises that will help us identify these processes and transform them. So that's something really exciting. And that's what we're going to really make the main focus of our talk today. So I'm going to share the screen again and show the next visual. That's 3. So this is the 12 links put in perspective of living a life or living through afflicted mental states. We already talked greatly in the last class about ignorance, the first 3: ignorance, action, cause, consciousness. When we say past, we can essentially say that's already happened. So there's nothing you can do about those. They're what has propelled us into the present. So these next set of links are the ones that are present to us every single moment. And so this is really where we can work. The third group, future, is birth, aging, and death. And those are where our future lies. We can think about that in terms of the next life or our next actual mental state that we might move to. We think about mini deaths. Again, I coined that phrase for today's class. You'll get sick of hearing that. But the present is where we are in this human realm. So, from a Buddhist point of view, we've already had the projected effect occur where we've been born here. And I think we could all tangibly say that for all of us, yeah, I'm a human. I might change mental states, meaning I might experience the different realms while being a human, as we discussed them previously. But I'm experiencing them as a human. You're not an animal. You're not a dog. You're not a God realm being. You're not a hell being. You're not a hungry ghost being, fundamentally. But you can experience those afflicted states that are associated with them. And that's what we discussed last time. So these are the links that we're going to focus on today in terms of how they play out from that point that we're born, which is the effect consciousness, move into the existence, this existence, not the next existence, which is we literally take on name and form. And that's where we're going to start to do a little bit more of our dive in today. So name and form here basically refers to the mental consciousness, what we bring forward with us moment by moment or from lifetime by lifetime is our consciousness. In Buddhist cosmology, we have something that is considered what's called a very subtle consciousness. And that's actually where karmic experiences happen. They are something that we sort of lay on top of that and move ignorantly, or with wisdom, we move forward. So that's something to think about, because as we come into the effect consciousness, remember, that's the moment of conception. We talked about that last time. You are coming into, as a consciousness, you're coming into a new birth, and it's your consciousness. And what is that consciousness? It's a very subtle consciousness that is able to move into, in the case of being born a human, you're moving into the union of your parents. That's the contributing factor. It's a main contributing factor. If two humans were not in union, you would not have the opportunity to move into this realm. And then from there, name and form develop through a pregnancy, whether it's an animal or a human. For us, it's humans. And so we develop first, our mental consciousness unfolds as it's started a new life. And then our other consciousnesses form, which refers to our body, essentially. And this is important. There's actually 4 mental aggregates that are part of our mental composition: feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and our consciousness. Remember, those come forth from our subtle consciousness. And then through the birth, not the birth process, but the embryonic process, that's the word I was looking for, the aggregates of our physical selves develop. Most of us know what that's about if we've studied embryonic development whatsoever, but that's where our aggregates, our form aggregates develop. So it's pretty much that kind of process that's going on in this link. Again, it's right at the beginning of the present existence that we're in. And that leads to the 5th link. And this is the development of what we call the 6th sense sphere. In our images, I'll find oops, going the wrong way. We looked at these last time. This is the 5th link, the 6th sense sphere. It's a fuzzy kind of a picture, but I want to put it up anyway. It shows a number of empty windows in an empty house. And that directly relates to, again, we're still in that embryonic process of our organs developing, not yet fully functioning. And when we talk about this part, though, we might say, well, you just said that, that happens in the previous, stage. And that's true when we talk about the form aggregates. But what we're talking about here aren't the literal 6 senses. We're talking about what we call the inner promoters of consciousness. There is an actual inner consciousness connected to each one of our sense experiences: eyes, ear, nose, tongue, body, and our mental senses. So that's what we're talking about here. That's why the house is empty, because they're not fully developed. But we have to remember, as we talk about these moving forward, and they're important because we're going to be talking about the different forms of consciousness as they actually function in our lives. They are not fully function here, and we're not talking about like a physical eye. For example, you could have physical eyes, but you could be blind, and that's because you have an absence of that subtle matter that allows one to see. Same thing with taste. You can have a tongue, but you could be born without taste. Same thing with your ears. You can have ears, but maybe you're deaf. So what we're talking about here in these 6 sense spheres are the subtle matter of the eye and the rest of the sense organs. They mature through this process. So this is the actual link where these critical functions that we need to have to experience life as a human, or could be any realm, are developed. And then the next realm, we talked about this in passing. Again, it's a kind of blown up, so it's fuzzy. But this is the link called contact. This is really, really, really an important link. I'll bring up another visual here. Excuse me. So on this chart, we talk about contact referring to that period in which the meeting of object, that's something outside of you, The sense power, that's one of those sense spheres that I was just talking about, not, not your actual eye, for example, but that which it moves that to experience something, and consciousness occur. So there's three parts to what causes what happens during contact experience as a sentient being. And here we're talking, we'll just leave it to talking about being human because we can relate to a little better. So this causes one to distinguish an object as pleasurable, painful, or neutral. And it's prior. This is really important. You got to remember this next thing. If you don't remember anything else I babble on about today, this definition of contact that I just shared with you is prior to the actual production of the next link, which is why it follows it. But you're going to see why I'm making such a big deal about it in a moment. And that production is that contact causes feeling, some kind of feeling. So in a little bit more detail, I drew up this graph to show that there are, make it as big as I can, these three factors that cause a consciousness, meaning the experience of contact and then a result of that, which is experienced by your consciousness. So the observed object is the first thing that is required. Again, remember, this is all about dependent arising. There has to be something to observe and come in contact with. And so there's the object. So this is the object that causes the consciousness to be generated into having its aspect. So, if you didn't have the example here is if you didn't have a patch of blue presented to your eye consciousness, you couldn't see blue. So I think you get the idea of the observed object being a critical ingredient to contact. And then the dominant condition, which is a sense power that causes particular consciousness to be able to apprehend only its respective type of object and not others, as when eye sense power gives a consciousness the capacity to apprehend a visual object, versus a sound object or some other object that might present itself to your six senses. So it's called dominant, therefore, so sticking with the idea of like the color blue being presented to our eye consciousness, our eye sense, then we would call that the dominant condition. And here's the big reveal. The third ingredient, the immediately preceding condition, is a consciousness. We're talking about your consciousness. A consciousness is produced as an experiential entity, is due to an immediate preceding consciousness. You're like, what the hell does that even mean? Or maybe you get it. But the idea of there being a production of a feeling, which is the next link, doesn't happen yet. That's why it's the next link. It can't happen until there is a immediately preceding consciousness, a moment of consciousness that interacts with these other two factors that cause that feeling. That's a really big deal. Why is that a big deal? Because it's connected to the actions we've taken previously that we've planted in our consciousness that are ripening constantly. And it is that moment, right when you're observing an object, dominate through one of your sense powers, that you have a ripening conscious experience that is an effect from a previously occurring action. This is how, when we talk about karma ripening and happening, and it's something that you can't control, so to speak, this is the key ingredient in contact, which leads to feeling. feeling whatever kind of feeling. So that's really important, because when we start talking about how to work with attachment and grasping, which come later in the flow of the links here, which are all part of our picture of present experience that's available to us, you'll see how you can work with that in meditation practice and affect change. It's kind of a big reveal in what the links can do, understanding the links and how they operate. So this is might be a little hard to get, but it's important to understand and to start to think about. I'll be sending these out to all of you so you can read through these little nuggets, because they really are at the essence of what really what is happening for us moment by moment. We have an observed object. We observe it with one of our sense spheres, and again, not our outer, eyes, ears, nose, etc., but an inner, what we call a dominant condition sense power, and that nothing can happen dependently arising wise, without there being an immediate preceding consciousness. And that's a ripening karma effect of a karmic action taken previously. That's kind of cool. I mean, in terms of sort of understanding what's going on there. This leads to the subsequent discrimination of an object as being attractive, unattractive, or neutral. It's just the force of our karmic ripening, because remember, all of our actions, as we talked about them in the second link, were motivated by the movement of our mind misapprehending the true nature of things. So we were grasping at or pushing away from us, or being neutral to these objects that then became completed, implanted themselves in our consciousness, and then later ripened, or later ripening in this present life that we're in. So once they all happen, these three conditions that make up a contact that happens moment by moment, they're happening constantly. Then we have the production, the subsequent experience of feeling. And that's why the next link is that. So something to really spend a lot of time on, in my opinion, is getting this. Getting this is so important. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A period as well. So then the next link is, that's not the next link. The next link is feeling. And that link is pretty straight ahead. This is what manifests after contact, as I just described it, and in the very specific way that I described what contact really is from this perspective of process within the link of dependent originating experience. It's essentially a mental factor that happens, that experiences pleasure, pain, or a neutral feeling, as I said earlier. And it's upon the object that you've interacted with. That could be a person, that could be a thing, that could be a concept in your mind. Doesn't even have to be something as, could be a blue sky, it could be a sunrise, it could be anything. It is anything and everything that you come in contact with, right? And of course, pleasurable feelings, this is pretty obvious, but it's important to state, generate a strong drive for more. And pain generates a strong drive for avoidance. So this is right here with experience, with how we experience contact and subsequent feelings, is where those other two main three poisons come into play. We could see process-wise how, if, as I've always said in all these classes, that the main culprit is ignorance or misapprehension. And then out of that comes experientially comes attachment or avoidance. You could see that here. You could see that moment by moment through contact with an object, having that observed object, and then that dominant condition in the sense of a sense power being at play, and then that immediately preceding condition, that immediately preceding consciousness ripening all at the same time, arising all at the same time, would lead to a constant barrage, so to speak, meaning moment by moment, second by second, it's happening lightning fast, experience of pleasurable or unpleasurable feelings. So the seventh link is pretty evident, self-evident, but you can see how it does connect right back to the center with the three poisons. And then that could lead to, depending on how you feel about it, could lead to you doing virtuous or non-virtuous activities, and how that could bring you into an afflicted mental state in one of the six realms. So I'm trying to tie it back into how the process is at play constantly. Then we move to the next, that's contact. Yeah, that's feeling. Pretty graphic, it's like an arrow in somebody's eye, but that's how intense and how powerful the ripening of karmic actions taken through the experience of contact lead to feelings. They're not for the faint of heart. And then this leads to the eighth link. So again, fuzzy picture, but essentially this is a person sitting at a, I would call it a bar, where they're drinking a beer. So, this is showing attachment. A person drinking beer, could be a group of people partying, it doesn't matter. But it's easy to understand, right? It's like, no matter how much you drink beer, sorry if I'm insulting anybody who enjoys beer. I enjoy a good beer once in a while. But no matter how much you drink beer, even though it makes you, and it does make you fat and put on weight, give you a beer belly, right? And you do not want to have that beer belly or be fat, you keep drinking because you're attached to it. You can't help it. So it's a good way to think about attachment. It's not like it's overwhelming, like you can't help attachment, but it's not as in the realm of desire and wanting something. It's not as intense as grasping, and that's why these two links are separate as experience, because one actually leads to the other. When one is partaking in things that one's attached to, even though it's weaker, the more you do it, the more it gets stronger. And remember, as we're talking about it here, hopefully this isn't getting too convoluted for you, but as we're talking about it here, it's within the context of present life experience. So these experiences of contact, of feeling, of attachment, they're all ripening consciousnesses, if you will, moment by moment consciousnesses of actions based on ignorance that have happened in the past. So we have a propensity for these types of desires. We've already done them. We've done them endlessly from a Buddhist perspective for lifetimes. That's partly why, from a Buddhist perspective, they're so strong. So we could talk about contact, and we could talk about feeling, we could even talk about attachment, and we can understand it. But it's like, we got to remember that what we're experiencing moment by moment are the karmic ripening effects of what we've already done in terms of actions based on ignorance, which we then call the cause consciousness, leading to this whole part of the cycle. This happens moment by moment. You can apply this again to moving from one afflicted mental state to the other. You don't have to think about it in terms of life cycles. Remember my concept of mini lives. So this is really important. And there are different kinds of attachment. I'm not going to talk about them today because we do a whole course on that. Well, maybe some of you would be bored with it, but the one type of, there's so many different types of attachments, but the one that is referenced here in the 12 links of dependent origination is desire. So it's to that one of the three main poisons that we understand to be one of the three main poisons, which is attachment. So this increases, and it increases and increases and increases. Part of the reason it increases, by the way, is that there isn't really any satisfaction that happens with within the realm of trying to experience impermanent things in a way that we think it's going to give us some sort of permanent joy or happiness. That's because we are misunderstanding the true nature of each one of these objects that we think. For example, drinking beer, we think it's going to give us something that makes us happy, but we mislabel it. We give it a quality, an inherent self-existent quality of this thing will make me happy. Well, that thing cannot make you happy. There's nothing coming from it. It's coming from you, where you put that on it, and it's always going to disappoint you. Why? Not because, I'm not speaking morally that beer is good or bad, but because it doesn't have that quality. So if you keep giving things qualities that they don't have, you label them with qualities, you then therefore experience them that way, they're going to disappoint. They're going to get you in trouble. So that's very, very important. And that's why in the present life, as well as ripening karma from past lives, attachment always leads to grasping, meaning a stronger version of attachment. It's so important in terms of the experience of the 12 links of dependent origination that they separate them out, because it's within the intensity, the repeating over and over and over, that the strength of attachment leads to grasping, which then gives it enough strength to create projecting an additional new projecting karmic experience that leads to another existence. Again, remember, this is the process of how are we stuck in suffering existence, and how do we end it? So the last thing to say about attachment is the boundaries of it occurs as the eighth link of this dependent arising experience. And as it's the eighth link, it is it's taking, in terms of living in the present, it's the experience of everything from the fourth link of name and form, like who I am, I'm John Cerullo, and I have this form, all the way up through using my sense spheres and my own contacts and my feelings, which lead to my attachments. They're all, you have to group them together in terms of what am I going to try to work with in this life, understanding the wheel of life, understanding the process of the 12 links of dependent arising. Well, this is where we get to the point where you are able to work with your attachments. Some of us have already moved in our experience to grasping the stronger version of attachment. So that's why it's part of what we're experiencing now. Remember, it isn't just like stopping new karmic ripenings or changing their characteristics so they don't become grasping. But this is really where we're going to do the work. So we're going to circle back to it. Real important. And then the ninth link is the again, fuzzy picture, but I only had small pictures, is grasping. And it is represented by a monkey taking fruit. Essentially, the monkey is moved through habitual pattern behavior. So being an animal has some real extra meaning here versus just like a human reaching for. There are some pictures in the Wheel of Life where this link is represented by a human, but it's much more appropriate that a human is represented in the previous attachment link and then an animal here, because the pattern behavior is so much more habitual and intense and strong where they can't break out of it. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the animal realm, pattern behavior. So this is this really, I think, is a really strong visual in that sense. So as I already said, it's an increasement of attachment. So it's a much stronger version of experiencing contact, which leads to feelings. So we're even more attached to pleasant forms and sounds and odors and tastes and touch and all of that. As well as I've neglected this whole time to talk about a mental consciousness, which is one of the 6 sense spheres. So, you know, you can, through the experience of that consciousness, going through contact and feelings and attachment, that can lead to, let's say, like wrong views or bad views or different ways of behavior associated with those views. You know, like maybe your consciousness for some reason gets involved in, I don't think I'm going to offend anybody by using this as an example, but maybe you get involved in some sort of satanic practice, you know, or racist beliefs, or some other kind of thing that sort of flies in the face of what most of us would think are ethical and moral behavior. So that could be another form of grasping. So just to put a finer point on this is the one I was going to bring up before. That's contact. So grasping. So I've already said this. You know, I just said what I have there up on the screen in the first paragraph. But what I do want to point out is that there's 4 varieties of grasping at objects. Again, I talked about a moment ago how you can grasp at an object by giving it a quality, by labeling it with something that will give, like beer, which can give you happiness when beer has no such quality. If you break it down, you can't find happiness in beer. It's not there. It's just made up of water and hops and some other ingredients, and you know, that's it. So you could apply that sort of view to any object in meditation, break it down, look for its inherent quality, self-existent quality. It ain't there. Where does it come from then? If I like beer so much and I start drinking too much where attachment becomes grasping, that's coming from me. It's coming from my own contact with it, my own feelings I develop in connection with it, and then having attachment to it, and then that, you know, leading to grasping. So you can have the same thing happen with the second variety of grasping, which is you can grasp at views of self. So in the study of understanding correct apprehension, wisdom of seeing things correctly versus ignorance or misapprehension, the 2 biggies are phenomena, which I just talked about, where you view phenomena as having some sort of quality that it doesn't have, which leads to this sort of troubled way that we move forward. And the next one is like how we view ourselves, where we think we have, as an individual, some inherent quality that exists, that is unchangeable, that me, John Cerullo, the I that I identify as John Cerullo, inherently self exists on its own without connection to anything, where the correct way of viewing self is that I exist functionally only in dependence on arising in connection with other people, other objects, etc. It's this. Of course, I went to the wrong. It's this process here that happens in contact. But misunderstanding that process is the problem. There's nothing wrong with the process. Get back to the right screen. But this gets all the way back to this insidious process of the constant flow of dependent origination process through the 12 links. It all goes back to what? Misunderstanding phenomena, which creates desire for objects, misunderstanding self or view of self. And these are the two biggies. And that's part of why in Buddhism, at least, and in the Buddha's wheel of life, understanding misapprehension is critical to moving forward and transforming our experiences that occur through contact and feeling. And then two others, grasping at bad systems of ethics and conduct, and at anything of the remaining types of bad views. These are big baskets that underscore how important it is to develop the two wings I talked about of practice. One that the first two help you directly in finding an antidote to misapprehension or ignorance of objects, or phenomena we call it, and self. The next two are the ones that move you beyond your moment by moment experience of if you were to reject these, if you were to stop grasping at bad systems of ethics and conduct and other types of bad views, they move you away from selfishness and self-cherishing. And that's that other wing of practice called compassion and love. So you could see how important these are. They're very, very, very important to understand that when we start working with attachment and grasping, how are we going to work with them? Well, you have to have something that you're focused on. And these are the four varieties of experience, of dependent arising experience that we need to work with. So very, very, very important. Yeah, so again, I'll be sending these around to everybody as these handouts that I'm showing you. And so just to take this and complete this part of the process that we're talking about right here, which is this present set of links, this set of links that are present to us now in this life, we're going to talk for a moment about how grasping leads into existence. So let me go to the next. This is the image of a pregnant woman. So before we start literally talking about the 10th link, just the way I talked about how attachment leads to to grasping, I wanted to underscore or highlight, put a spotlight on how grasping leads to existence. So just as attachment is a stronger version of, grasping is a stronger version of attachment, what happens when that grasping becomes so experientially in body, speech, and mind, become so intense, if you will, or so strong, that serves to potentialize, or should I say, charge up the karmic potency. And that is what directly leads to nourishing, being nourished by, remember, repeat it, partaking in these strong grasping tendencies. And they could be whatever they are. And that goes to looking at ourselves individually with reflection. They set up the effect, the cause consciousness for a new existence, another round of suffering existence. That's the cause. This link is the cause for fully potentialized karma. So like that, projecting karma. Now it starts all over again, so to speak. So if we keep that in mind, we could see how existence is very similar to the effect consciousness phase of the third link. It's like that moment of conception. Right? It sounds similar, because this is how the links move forward, layered. They're not really happening chronologically, whether we talk about moving from one afflicted mental state to another, or from one life to another. There's so many overlapping realities going on, that the links are really just trying to paint the clearest linear picture of what's going on. So the 10th link is illustrated by a pregnant woman. And sometimes the woman, not in this picture, is clutching some flowers, which I won't talk about since she's not doing that. But this is right where the karma produces that next lifetime, but it's not yet manifest. So that's why the person's pregnant and not yet fully developed child is like not revealed yet, if you will, hasn't emerged. So this 10th link lasts from the time of the fully potentialized karma up to the beginning of the next lifetime. Very similar to the effect consciousness and name and form parts of the earlier links in this description that we're giving you here. And there's two types of two levels of this link that I could talk about, but it kind of goes down a rabbit hole, so I'm going to skip that, even though I have them here in my notes, and also for the interest of time. And then this leads to the obvious next link, which is actual birth. Fuzzy picture again, sorry, but this is a woman who just gave birth to a baby. This is the baby over here, and her cuddled in her right arm. And this is the link of dependent arising of birth, and refers to the point of conception, of post-conception, and emergence from the womb. We've now changed the state, and it sort of ties all the way back into our going back into this part of moving into a new life. So in a way, which I'll talk about in a minute, we could say that, like in this linear presentation of the links, we could see how ignorance and action and cause consciousness lead to effect consciousness, name and form, etc. Well, here we could see how these, in this present life we're in now, all of us, these done ignorantly, these of attachment and grasping, especially grasping done ignorantly, create new actions, which go, so even though they're not stated here in the flow of the links, but these are happening, these three of the past, ignorance, action, cause, are happening simultaneously as we're experiencing these. Because that's what's actually happening all over again. Through ignorance, we're causing new actions, which are caused by self-cherishing grasping, leading to a new existence. So hopefully that makes sense. And then the last link is in this picture is a person like, essentially already reaching maybe the dying process. But it's meant to depict somebody who is aging, but also it can look as if somebody's, that man on the rock is also dead, because this is the link of aging and death. Sometimes this link is, you'll see it pictured as a person carrying up a really steep hill some sort of burdens or a bundle on their back. In Tibetan Buddhism, that bundle would specifically be a corpse. And the reason is that it's your own. I mean, it's pretty intense when you think about it that way. But that's what it means to be in suffering existence. So now that we've covered all of the 12 links, and we could see how this graphic again makes some sort of sense, I'm going to give you a more complicated version of this graphic. Again, I'll send all these to you. This is really small, and I apologize. So if you can't see it, I'm sorry, but I wanted to show it on one screen. So this is a picture of the 12 links, like one round, basically what I just rambled through. And at the top, it shows projecting causes in a lifetime prior to this lifetime. So you guys should know what that is. That would be 1 and 2 and the first half of 3. Okay, ignorance, action, and cause consciousness. And then staying in that same space, we could look over to the right and we see listed actualizing causes in a lifetime just prior to the present life. And this is what I was just talking about. Attachment, grasping, and existence. So as it relates to the present lifetime, when we participate in attachment and grasping leading to existence, we're doing what we did in a past lifetime. Ignorantly partaking in actions causing karmic ripenings called cause consciousness, which lead to here the projected effects in the present lifetime, the effect consciousness, name, form, sense spheres, contact, and feeling. And then these are similar, like I just talked about. We go over to the right column of actualized effects in the present life, which is a new birth, aging, and death. And then moving down here, maybe I'll move down and make this a little bigger now. I could do that. So we could say it. There we go. Actualizing causes in the present lifetime. This is what I've been harping on for the last half hour or so. Actualizing causes means, remember, as it relates to karma, which is why we talked about karma, so we can learn how karma works. Causes are actions that we take in body, speech, and mind, and they create when they're completed. We talked about that last time when we talked about the second link. It has to be a completed action. We won't go into the details of that. That's a whole course we could do too on the laws of karma, but it essentially creates causes through what? Through partaking in more attachments and more graspings leading to existence. So if we move over to this column, it's projecting causes in the present lifetime or any prior lifetime. That has to do with what we talked about last time with projecting karma. It's what I talked about earlier again. This is what is similar to ignorance, compositional action, they call it here, it's action, or cause consciousness. So the last part of this chart, actualized effects in the next lifetime, that means through, having done these activities, it leads to, new birth, aging, and death. Projected effects in the next lifetime end up in a new consciousness, affect consciousness, a new name and form, a new sense sphere, new contacts, new feelings, new attachment, new grasping, new existence. So that's a lot of like, like sort of processing the actual flow of one round of the 12 links. But these are all really important. They're important in the sense that if we don't take time to understand the process, we can understand architecturally, sort of schema-wise, the wheel itself, as we studied the, whether we're looking at a contemporary wheel or the classic wheel, we studied the inner circle of the three poisons, and then the two virtuous and non-virtuous activities circle, and then the six realms in depth. Those aren't, they weren't hard to understand once we really drilled down and went through them, and we even applied them to understanding all of our afflicted mental states and what realm we might be in moment by moment. And we even did some meditation practices of how we could work with them. But the real meat and potatoes comes down to what, Joseph Goldstein talked about, which is breaking the chain. And that, my friends, happens by studying closely the 12 links of dependent origination. So all these charts, especially this one and this one and the one we did last week, which was this one, and understanding them link by link and how they're attached and how they overlay, especially as they overlay in this graphic, is so important, because without really understanding them, we can't tie them back into why they're even on the outer rim of the wheel, where they have the inner wheels of the three poisons, the two virtuous and non-virtuous activities in the six realms. They're dynamically tied to them, because this is how we move moment by moment through our existence, through one life to another, or put that aside, from one afflicted mental state to the other. And the reason these are in red is because here's where we can do the work. If we understand that in this lifetime, especially how contact works and how feeling works and how that leads to attachment and grasping, then, and we zero in on that, we have and we understand that in the context of karmic ripening, we have the opportunity to, and also understanding the true nature of things, which goes back to this graphic. We could work with our grasping, and we can work with our attachments. And we can work with meditation practices that allow us to look at how, through contact, got to bring up the right graphic here, this process, this three-factor process of what causes a consciousness, what causes an experience in our life, we could start to see it in our meditation practice, identify it, identify the object, see that we're experiencing it with a dominant condition of one of our sense powers, and most importantly, see that how we're experiencing it is caused by an immediate preceding consciousness, which then leads to that next moment experience of actually feeling it. And if you could work with that in a meditation, seeing this process when objects arise on your mental horizon in meditation, you will, and then you could take that off the cushion and see how it's operating as you go through life, moment by moment, like you're sitting in this Zoom session or any other moment of experience. It's happening, just constantly. It's a torrid, rapid ripening process, which is why to look at it on this level, it's best to try to do it on the cushion in meditation practice and just identify it. Just identify. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's a mental afflictive state that you're identifying, maybe all the better, as long as you can deal with that. You don't want to beat yourself up. We talked about being gentle and kind when you're practicing what they call in psychology insight. And I'm not a psychologist. I'm only a student of this type of system. So you have to be really careful. But you don't have to apply it to that. This is understanding this process and then seeing, even in a mental experience in meditation, how that leads to a feeling. Then you should be able to directly see how your attachments and or grasping to things can be worked on. And here's the reality. If you are experiencing something through contact, and that leads to feeling, and it's already sort of predetermined, if you will, by that previous moment of consciousness that arises in direct connection with the object and the sense consciousness or mental consciousness, then how could you ever change every moment that arises? How could you do that if it's coming from past ripening karma? This is something that maybe you haven't thought of, but you probably should think of. I used to think about it a lot, and it used to freak me out, especially once I studied and, if you will, accepted in my own life, in my own experience, cause and effect or karmic ripening. So it's a question you need to ask yourself. How is it possible to then change your experience? How is it possible to do what Joseph Goldstein talked about, which is no longer experiencing that feeling of pleasant or unpleasant as being pleasant or unpleasant, but just experiencing it, and maybe experiencing it with purpose? And the reality of that really has to do with studying a little bit more the true nature of things. It's what we talked about throughout this course. And that goes to working with grasping in a very specific way, where you study the true nature of desired objects. What is the true nature of those objects? So when they appear to your mind in meditation, even looking at yourself, when yourself appears to mind, you can do an exercise of looking at the true nature of that object, or looking at the true nature of yourself. And an object can be others or phenomena. Self is yourself. And that starts to break down ignorance or misapprehension. And the more fluidly you can start to experience objects, self, and other phenomena, and yourself, not as existing inherently on its own, fixed, but can peacefully and fluidly and consciously experience those things as just simply dependent arising. And most important, relax in that as that object comes on your horizon. Relax means being open and spacious. You hear that in meditation, guided meditation, all the time. Well, why do they say that? Why are they trying to create that sort of guided meditator trying to create that sort of experience? Because whether they're doing it in an informed way or not, they are leading you beyond attachment and grasping. I feel it's good to do, and Buddhist practitioners in the wheel teaching itself teaches that it would be good to do it consciously, meaning understanding what that object really is, so that whether it's something about yourself or fundamentally yourself, but it could be one of your emotional states or your mental afflicted states, or it could be how you experience an object, seeing its true nature. And that's why these 4 varieties of grasping are so damn important, because you could read this and go, okay, cool. But this is where you do the work. You do the work on the cushion by working with objects and working with yourself and working with your mental states. And talking about the process, do it built on the foundation of understanding contact. It's so important. It's because this immediate preceding consciousness is the 3rd ingredient that's coming about, that in your meditation session, if you could start to see that your consciousness is simply a moment by moment flow of karmic ripenings, you could interrupt that. I talked about this in one of our previous sessions, where you can take a karmic experience and, like an air traffic controller, land it when it's coming in for a landing, and instead of pulling it up to the gate and having the passengers to board, to have it go into an airplane hangar and close the door so it doesn't have to ripen. The only way you could do that is to interrupt the flow of what ripens in this graphic here, what's already ripened and happening. Ignorance, action, caused effect consciousness, that's now ripening here through this process in the present. So it's like you find a way to do that. The way to do that is to become wise to understanding as these experiences, moment by moment experiences, actually occur. Best place to do it is on a meditation cushion, because there you don't have a lot of noise. You have some noise coming in, but even the noise you can analyze this way. What is its true, nature? What is my true nature? So, and then there's another aspect of this that is to, when you're doing that in meditation, like an air traffic controller, you're interrupting, if you will, the flow of the way you would have normally experienced that desirous object or grasping to yourself, with the antidote being seeing it not ignorantly, not misapprehending it, but clearly, and then relaxing in that, in a way that it causes you to feel happy, where it brings you, allow yourself to feel happy and rejoice in experiencing that object in that way. Why would you rejoice and be happy? Because you have self-knowledge that you've broken, as Joseph Goldstein talks about, you've broken the chain of conditioning, which is the way you would normally repeatedly experience that. Hating something, loving something, desiring something, averting something, on and on and on and on and on and on, discriminating. You're breaking it. And he calls it, you do it with a mindfulness and awareness that is, he calls it a hammer stroke. Your mental process that I just described that you can do in meditation practice is one that weakens one chain at a time, each chain little by little, whereby they break and then they eventually dissolve, where you don't experience things through contact and then the arising feeling in the same way that you always have. Here's the process, and here's how you break it. And one of the tricks, I'll go all the way back to David Nichtern's book. He likes to use this word in meditation where he calls it gap. The word is gap. What do you think he means by gap? I mean, I'm not asking you. You can talk about it when I finish my session. But you know, what does he mean by that? He's talking about a space in meditation practice, and it's a gap between what? Between arising thoughts or arising consciousness experiences. And the gap is a special place. It's open and spacious. It's a place that kind of goes beyond conception, which is a glimpse of nirvana, in the sense that there's no suffering. There's no suffering. It's open and spacious. And the more you can do analytical meditation, which is what I was just referring to in terms of how to work with grasping, say with desirous objects or views of self, you should also try to nurture the experience of the gap, where in meditation, you allow yourself to relax and abide in open spaciousness. Because, and why? Not only because it feels good, but if you could then consciously be aware that that experience is it is actually the true nature of all things, meaning it's empty. It doesn't have any self-inherent quality, only dependent arising. And that's what gives you that open spaciousness. And then you can rejoice in that. That's why I said that. You could be happy. Because when you get up off the cushion, the more you can interact with objects of other people and phenomena, and also when you're with yourself and experiencing mental afflictive states, if you can learn how to quickly identify what's going on that has happened through contact feelings and attachment and leading to grasping, you'll be able to utilize that as a tool. Allow yourself maybe to slip into a moment of the gap. The more you do it, it's like exercise. The more you do it, the more you'll be able to have a moment by moment experience of getting out of the torrent flow that's the rapids, like, you know, the Colorado River flow of karmic ripening experiences that have habitually been placed in your mind's in your consciousness through previous actions based on ignorance. Because doing that is the antidote to ignorance, because it's looking at an object and seeing its true nature, and also analytically where it's come from. Experientially, in this life, this stuff, where did it come from? Came from contact feeling, being experienced in a certain way based on previous karmic ripenings, leading to further attachments, grasping, and existence. That's the chain you're trying to, when we talk about the chain you're trying to break, that's what we're talking about. And in an ultimate way, that leads to breaking this. And you don't have to think about this as like a grandiose way of like conquering birth and death and aging. You could think about the existence being equal to a habitual mental state, afflictive state that you've always had. What if you could have that in your mind mean existence, the existence of that? I want that to no longer exist. That's what you could be applying it to. And then that doesn't lead to the birth, meaning of more of that kind of afflictive mental experience. And which, of course, leads to the tiresome reality of aging and death. And that could be in the sense of that repeated mental that afflictive mental state that you get tired of. And it's gonna, you know, you've heard the expression, that's gonna be the death of me, you know. You don't have to be talking in a finality sense. So use your expansive ability to concretize this in a practical, daily way, And you'll see, I think, that the 12 links of dependent origination, like we talked about the 6 realms and then the inner circles where they come from, you could see how this could be the wheel itself in whole can be a practical method for living, a set of tools that you could work with. And of course, there are very specific meditation practices that you can do to combat ignorance. We have books full of them in Tibetan Buddhism. And there are lots of meditation practices and attachment and grasping. And we talked about them earlier in this course as being the medicine, the antidote for these two, attachment and grasping, and they have to do with compassion training. So again, the 2 wings of practice, wisdom, which is the antidote to ignorance, and then compassion. Practicing of compassion is the antidote to attachment and grasping. They will transform your actions, and that will transform what existence is for you, the habitual pattern of afflicted mental states. So that when you go through this process, whether you're talking about just in this life, if you will, or in cyclical life, this can be a pleasant experience and an informed experience, a joyful experience, and yes, even a blissful experience, one that is happiness versus suffering. And in a Buddhist context, of course, we talk about it as a method through the Buddha's 4 noble truths of first truth of life being suffering, cause of suffering being what we talked about in dependent arising here through the discussion on the 12 links. And then the 3rd noble truth being that there's an end to it. Well, that's what we've been talking about here. And I've been trying to make it a practical practice that you can do. And that the 4th noble truth is that there's a path. Well, again, the wheel is presenting you with a path. So the wheel is really a representation of the Buddha's 4 noble truths in action. And we look at that as a way to literally end birth, aging, and death, like the Buddha did. And from my personal perspective, because I was raised a Christian and a Catholic, that's how I experience other, especially religious figures like Jesus Christ. I experience him as a Buddha, meaning someone who has lived life, understood it correctly, lived it then correctly, provided an example to us correctly, and actually did conquer birth, aging, and death, i.e. The death and resurrection of Christ. So I don't see this sort of teaching that the wheel is being one. I'll stop sharing the screen. That is exclusive to Buddhists, which is one of the reasons I feel it's important to try to spend time making an effort to do a class like this where we can teach it beyond the sort of confines and boundaries of its architecture and cosmology. So hopefully I've done that, because essentially this is the end of the class, and I wanted it to be something where I tied the 12 links into some practical way of working with it. So even if you just stick with the meditations that David Nichtern provides in his book, you'll be in good shape. But if you could take it a step further, because David, as I said in the last class, didn't really explore the 12 links too much, you can find meditation practices that will allow you to work with the knowledge that you've gained from this class, hopefully, and maybe some of your own reading and then your own reflection and exploration, you should be able to apply similar meditation processes to each one of the links. Work with each one of them. But the ones during this precious human life that we have, just like we started the class talking about John Simpson, don't take it for granted. Work with your attachments and your grasping, those two links, and then work backwards and understand where they came from and bring them front and center in your meditation experience with apprehension, correct apprehension, and with loving kindness and compassion. And you should be able to see that you can do what Joseph Goldstein talked about, that I read at the top of the class, which is break the chains. Weaken them first, and then break them, and then eventually dissolve them. And I've talked about this being something that you have to work at. So in Buddhism, one of the things I really love about it is that you're told that everything you learn in teachings, you have to reflect on, and then you have to practice. Practice means meditation in our system. That's what it means to be a yogi. And it's really important. You can't really consider yourself a Buddhist unless you believe in the Four Noble Truths, but that you just, but it doesn't stop there. Let's say I learned from Geshe Darge, that he gave a class in New York once where he talked passionately about you could be the most learned Buddhist scholar and be able to out-talk, out-debate anybody. And in Buddhism, being able to debate and win a debate is a big deal, because debating is part of like formal monastic training. You should Google, if you're not familiar with Tibet Buddhist debating tactics, you should Google it and watch one. It's pretty intense. But he said, if you don't practice, then you're not a Buddhist, So the wheel is a Buddhist teaching. It can be applied in a very contemporary way, and is really important not to feel like if you're not a Buddhist, you can't. But the point of that messaging is do it within the context of knowing you have to practice, you have to do the work. Okay, let me see if we have some questions. All right. Yeah, so Louisa thanked me for the teaching and asked that we dedicate today's class to our kind, earnest, and ever generous, or was he generous in so many ways, friend John Simpson. So we will do that. We talked about John at the beginning of the class. Louisa, I don't know if you were here, and we did a prayer, but we will do we'll dedicate today's class to him as well. So yeah. So lots of thanks coming through on the chat. Doesn't seem like there's any questions, but I was hoping there might be a few questions, because we're going to end after the questions. It won't be a meditation that we do today. Anybody have any questions? Okay, let's see.
John, there's a question.
Yeah, I see.
And I'll answer the one about the YouTube and real quick. So all the YouTube teachings stay on YouTube. So unless we consciously take them down, they will be there.
Great. Okay, Richard asks, how is it true that sense consciousness is the subtle matter of the sense? You can have an eye consciousness even if you are born blind. Yeah, I talked about that, but probably not too skillfully, Richard, so I apologize. You're absolutely right that when we talk about the consciousness of an individual, if you will, that experiences karma, as we described it. And then that moves from the second link to the third link in the form of causal consciousness, leading to effect consciousness. It then finds its next place, if you will, for a next life. It's only in the form of consciousness. We can't say that the individual physically continues. I mean, that's just not the case. But what does the consciousness, the karmic, especially projecting karma, carries with it, once that your consciousness does reach the point of conception, which is called effect consciousness, it carries those seeds with it, and they then take shape both physically, in the form of, like, let's say a body like this with senses like eyes, ears, nose, all of that, but they maintain where they really came from, which is what we call the subtle consciousness of the senses. So you might say, well, why do you go all the way back to describing how a consciousness moves forward? It's because what is really experienced in that three ingredient of having an object and then perceiving it with the dominant condition is that subtle consciousness that is an eye consciousness, that is an ear consciousness, that is a nose consciousness, a touch consciousness, a mental consciousness. So that's how an eye consciousness can exist for someone, even if they're blind. And hopefully that makes sense to you, because it is something that isn't about this coarse physical level of matter, if you will. And that could be a fun class to have, because you could do some debates in that. Like your question's like a great debate question, by the way. Yvonne says, is the cause consciousness the bardo? The cause consciousness, and I'm speaking to the Buddhist in the room, and also from a Buddhist cosmology point of view. The cause consciousness is the consciousness that after death and the body, the most subtle consciousness exits the body, it moves into the bardo. It's what propels a consciousness, an entity, through the bardo. And that's why we use the word projecting. It projects it. It's almost like you're forced to move in a specific way. And it's propelled and projected to exclusively look for a rebirth, and doesn't complete until that cause consciousness isn't completed until it actually has found a new birth. So indeed, the cause consciousness is the entity, if you will, that moves from one lifetime to another for a sentient being, not just a human, obviously. So, any other questions? Oh, I can't hear you. Karen, are you trying to ask a question? You're muted. There you are.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was typing it, but I'll say it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Typically, normally, day to day, we usually operate on an autopilot basis. So by practicing on the meditation cushion, that space, very brief space in between our contact and feeling, by practicing there, will we be able to eventually improve on catching ourselves in our day-to-day life between that contact and feeling, because it happens so darn quickly.
Yeah.
We need to like slow that time. We need to give ourselves the space in between contact and feeling. It just happens so quickly.
it happens not only quickly, it happens multiple times per second. I think earlier in this course, when we were talking about karma, when I was describing its characteristics, I talked about for a human that karmic ripenings, individual karmic ripenings happen on average like 65 every finger snap, rapid finger snap. So how do you wrestle that to the ground? The only tools we really have available to us are certain types of meditation practices and getting on the cushion and using mindfulness meditation with analytical, pointed first analytically at a very specific object of topic, when I say object, and then staying with that. We're talking about shutting all that out that I just talked about and what you're alluding to, like literally, if you're doing it well, and just holding that and calmly abiding in that one experience. That's like doing exercise. And the more you do that, and you won't be able to do it very well, like if you could do it for a few seconds and then all of the thoughts start flooding in, well, that's an accomplishment. That's just like taking the first step. But the more you do it, you'll be able to run the marathon, meaning you'll be really good at it and you could do it for a long period of time. You won't just be able to run 100 yards, you'll be able to run a quarter mile, half a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, meaning take that meditative experience, mindfully stay with it. The object you analyze, like what's the true nature of phenomena? What's the true nature of self? Just stay with that, try. And the more you do that, meaning meditate every day. Maybe you only have time to do it 10 minutes a day, but then maybe try to do it 2 times 10 minutes a day or 3 times 10 minutes a day. The more you can do it, the longer you'll be able to do it. And then you'll develop what's called mental and physical pliancy, where you could stay with an object for a long period of time. I'm talking about on the cushion. And what happens, we call it in Buddhism, we call it between session practice, meaning between sessions, meditation sessions. You take that with you off the cushion and apply it to your day-to-day, moment-by-moment experiences. And you're sure tootin', right, that it's really hard because everything moves so fast. Even if you're living someplace that is tranquil, it isn't just about your environment, it's about what's going on here, what's ripening. How quickly is your mind moving and how is it moving? So doing those sorts of processes really allow for that to seep in, and like exercise, you get to be, good at it, and then you could eventually become a master. Eventually, you could ideally walk around 24/7 and experience everything correctly or without misapprehension, and do it with a sense of pliancy, openness, spaciousness, blissfulness, and not reacting to the arrow coming into your eye the way that you normally would. So it's not easy. I can't argue, not that you're arguing with me, but it's only about, it goes back to your question goes back to underscoring the point about practice, that this isn't a quick fix. It's about the way you conduct applying what you've learned here. And you can't beat yourself up if it appears to not be working or it's not moving quick enough, because it isn't like going to the doctor and getting a prescription for like Xanax or something else that maybe would help you. There's nothing wrong with medications, but it isn't gonna have more, sort of the instant effect. For some people it does, because they have the karmic propensities from previous lifetimes, if you will, for them to sit on a cushion and go bing, they hit it. But I'm sort of speaking to the rest of us, so I'm not saying it isn't possible. Somebody in this session might be somebody who has made great strides in a short period of time, and that's totally wonderful, and it's great. I would be so happy if I could do that. So So you have to have patience. That comes to, like, Master Shantideva's 6 perfections, the third one being patience. But patience goes with the 4th one, which is joyous effort, right? Like, even if you have slow going, have patience, have joyful effort in the little bit of progress you might make off the cushion, which was your question. But don't beat yourself up when you maybe feel like you're slip sliding through every day or something like that. That happens a lot, I think, to a lot of us. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, John.
Okay. So we've reached the end of the 2 hours, and we've reached the end of this course. And I want to thank all of you for being part of it. As somebody who has practiced this teaching many years in my life, I will tell you that when you then take it to a different place, meaning you try to share it with others in an informed way, hopefully I did that, in an engaging way where it doesn't put everybody to sleep or get too theoretical or doesn't have context and meaning, I experienced the teaching in a completely different way and on a completely different level, and it provided new insights to me. And for all of that, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you to even take your precious time to be with me during these sessions that we've done. And as I've said previously, I part of my practice is to look at everyone in my life as great enlightened bodhisattvas, and I'm just a humble student. And I look at all of you that way and feel that you're helping me immensely by being here in my life, dependently arising to be able to do this teaching, because I've gotten so much out of it, is what I'm trying to say. So I have great gratitude for that. So let's leave it there. But let's remember, as Louisa asked, that we remember John. And for those of you who maybe missed the very beginning, we did speak about John as best we could in the moment, being thankful for his presence in our lives. And for those of you who didn't know him, think of someone in your life who has really provided you something along the lines of what I, maybe poorly, but I think you can get some sort of picture of what I tried to share with you in terms of who John was to us at DNKL, and what he'll continue to mean to us as a Dharma family. So don't let your mind be empty. Try to think about someone who you know, and we'll repeat the little prayer that we did at the beginning to close our session today in memory of John, and to dedicate today's teaching to him. I'm thankful that I was able to get through this today, and then we'll do the dedication that I normally do, and then we'll end our session. So let's at least, we're not doing a meditation, but let's quiet down our minds a bit with everything that I just said in mind about John, and try to find a happy, peaceful space, because as we say this prayer, it's very important to be joyous and happy for this person as they're able to experience our prayer in whatever way they're able to experience it, and our thoughts and intentions towards him and what we might be thinking. What's most helpful is that it's peaceful, calm, loving, encouraging, and something that can help John as he moves forward stay connected to the Dharma. So keep that in mind, and we'll do the Tibetan dying prayer, very short dying prayer, and then I'll do the dedication. So take a moment just to quiet yourself. Through your blessing, grace, and guidance, through the power of the light that streams from you, may all your negative karma, destructive emotions, obscurations, and blockages be purified and removed. May you know yourself forgiven for all the harm you may have thought and done. May you accomplish this profound practice of POA and die a good and peaceful death. And through the triumph of your death, may you be able to benefit all sentient beings, living or deceased. We dedicate this to you, John, on your journey. And now for the final dedication of this class in this series. By the goodness of the deed I have just done, may all sentient beings complete the collection of merit and wisdom, and thus gain the ultimate two bodies that wisdom and merit make. May what I've learned here today be wholly dedicated to the future well-being and happiness of all sentient beings, where there is no longer any suffering existence, and only happiness and endless joy, especially for our dear friend, John Simpson. So I wish all of you the rest of a good day on this Sunday, and hopefully the rain stops where you are. And do all of your actions today for not yourself, but for John and for John's memory. That would make the biggest difference to all of us at DNKL. And carry him with you, especially over the next 49 days, in whatever little way you can, in your thoughts and prayers, but have it be positive, have your emotions be positive as they're directed to him. And feel free to recite that little prayer. There's much more lengthy Buddhist prayers for the dying. Geshe Darge is a good source for that. But that's my modest offering for today. Be well, everyone, and thank you again for being part of this.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.